The story began in 1998 in the state of Pennsylvania, where an 11-year-old American boy started recounting memories that his parents couldn't explain. The family resided in a quiet residential area marked by the typical daily routine of families balancing school, work, and community activities. The boy, Michael Turner, was known to his teachers as disciplined, reserved, and particularly gifted in history. Up until this point, there was nothing to suggest that he harbored memories seemingly originating from another era. The initial observations occurred during a Sunday dinner. The mother, Elaine Turner, would recall years later that her son was observing the set table as if something were out of place. Almost automatically, he remarked, "The chalice doesn't belong on that side. The right hand must hold it first." The family laughed, assuming it was a quirky piece of information he'd picked up in a book somewhere. But Michael insisted that he did it that way, though he couldn't explain who this he was. Similar incidents recurred over the following weeks. During a visit to the local church, Michael walked directly into the sacristy and, to the surprise of the staff, recognized items he had never seen before. He touched an old stole and muttered, "It was heavier than I remember." The resident pastor, Father Thomas McCallan, later told the family that the boy had correctly described liturgical practices that were not part of their Protestant congregation's traditions. The father, Richard Turner, a mechanical engineer, tried to find psychological explanations. He suspected a vivid imagination, the influence of movies, or perhaps secret reading. Yet, the precision of the details was striking. Michael described the interior of a European Catholic church, complete with specific stained glass windows depicting scenes from the life of St. Augustine. Being a family with a Protestant background, they had never traveled to Europe nor had close contact with Catholic communities. The case took a more serious turn when Michael started having recurring dreams. He would wake up in a cold sweat, speaking disconnected phrases in Latin. The mother recorded one of these nights and consulted a classical languages professor at the local university. The professor confirmed that, despite the childlike pronunciation, the boy was reciting fragmented excerpts from prayers traditionally used by Catholic priests before the 1950s. Given this highly unusual information, the school's educator sent a report to a colleague who was familiar with the work of Canadian psychiatrist Ian Stevenson, a globally recognized authority in the research of spontaneous memories of possible past lives. At the time, Stevenson was still actively conducting investigations, analyzing clinical materials sent in by researchers and doctors interested in his methods. Michael's case reached him through documents submitted by the family themselves, along with recordings and descriptions of the boy's behavior. Stevenson, already experienced in evaluating child cases, noted that the pattern fit what he classified as persistent spontaneous utterances, which typically concentrate between the ages of 2 and 12. While he didn't immediately travel to every case received, he read all the reports closely to identify verifiable elements. And in Michael's case, there was a particularly fascinating component. The boy claimed to have been a European priest who died in the 1940s, stating that he had left behind a message from the divine that needed to be recovered. His parents were unsure how to interpret this. But as the reports grew more consistent, they realized their son's story required deeper investigation. When the Turners decided to formally document their son's reports, Michael was already describing fragments of a routine that wasn't his own, almost always upon waking. Some days, he'd say he remembered walking through a stone cloister. On others, he mentioned hearing bells that didn't exist in their American neighborhood. The sensory precision was notable. He described the smell of hot wax dripping from candles during services, the rough texture of an old cassock, and even how the late afternoon light streamed through multicolored stained glass windows. These reports, noted by the mother in a school notebook, were sent to Ian Stevenson, along with audio recordings and drawings done by Michael himself. In one of them, the boy reproduced the facade of a church with a single spire and a round clock. The architectural style resembled Catholic places of worship in southern Germany, particularly those rebuilt after World War II. For an 11-year-old boy with no exposure to European references, the drawing seemed suspiciously specific. Upon receiving the material, Stevenson requested the family's permission to proceed with a preliminary investigation. His established method aimed first to analyze whether the accounts contained factual elements that could be corroborated. In Michael's case, two details interested the researcher: the liturgical Latin used before the 1962 reforms, and the description of a stained glass window featuring St. Augustine holding a codex. While Stevenson analyzed the documentation, the Turners tried to maintain their everyday life at home. The family was not associated with mystical religious groups, nor did they encourage supernatural interpretations. On the contrary, they avoided exposing the boy to community comments to prevent influencing his statements. But Michael himself seemed to carry a growing burden. One morning, he sat at the breakfast table and told his mother with the seriousness of a much older person, "I left something behind. I didn't deliver the message." Elaine tried to comfort him, but the boy couldn't explain what it was. He only reiterated that someone needed to know. Michael's behavior now alternated between moments of apathy and a sort of deep concentration, as if trying to recall something that eluded him. His history teacher reported that when Michael saw a photo of Freiburg in a textbook, he murmured, "That's close." When asked to explain, he just said he remembered walking through narrow cobblestone streets and hearing conversations in German. The family had no German ancestry and did not speak the language. Upon receiving this new report, Stevenson considered increasing the rigor of the investigation. He had already documented numerous cases of children describing locations and routines of past lives with verifiable elements, particularly between the ages of 3 and 7. The fact that Michael was 11 placed the case at the upper limit of the typical age range, but didn't make it any less relevant. The researcher noted that late reports often appeared in children who suppressed unusual memories out of fear of misunderstanding. As the documentation progressed, a potentially decisive clue emerged. Michael mentioned the name Father Johann, repeating it with strong emotion, as if lamenting a loss. The name, common in Germany and Austria, seemed to be a direct reference to the identity of the priest he believed himself to be. From this point, the investigation would require correlating the reports with historical archives. The family cautiously agreed, aware that the search might uncover a real and perhaps unsettling story hidden among the ruins of post-war Europe. When the name Father Johann first emerged clearly, Ian Stevenson instructed the family to document every new episode without intervention, avoiding questions that could influence the boy. The instruction was simple: allow the memories to surface spontaneously. The mother placed a small recorder near the bed, and on several nights, Michael spoke disconnected phrases in English, Latin, and occasionally some German-sounding words, though distorted by lack of fluency. Based on these audios, Stevenson sent a letter to the family, suggesting a preliminary search in public ecclesiastical archives. He didn't propose identities, but merely structured the method to check for records of a priest named Johann serving in the 1940s in regions of southern Germany where churches with St. Augustine's stained glass windows were common. This filtering, according to his scientific approach, could reveal both coincidences and potential points of correlation. Meanwhile, the Turners' daily life continued, albeit imbued with an atmosphere of caution. The school sought to be discreet, but some teachers noticed changes in the boy's behavior. During an art class, while working with clay, Michael molded something that initially looked abstract but soon took shape. A small, rectangular box with a symbol resembling a stylized cross on top. When the teacher asked what it was, he replied with apparent surprise at his own memory, "I kept messages in here." When he brought the object home, he told his father that he remembered hiding it behind a loose stone near the left side of the altar. The remark, too specific to ignore, was immediately documented by the family. Reading the report, Stevenson noted that many of the cases he studied involved memories of specific locations where the presumed former personality had hidden objects or left something written. However, the idea of a message mentioned by Michael seemed to carry an unusual emotional weight, and this caught Stevenson's attention. Just a few days later, another element surfaced. The mother showed her son a general church photo from a European tourism catalog with no identified location. Michael looked for a few seconds and shook his head, but upon turning the page, he saw the image of a Baroque church rebuilt in Bavaria in the 1950s. His eyes fixed, his breathing quickened, and he said, "It's similar, but the tower was darker, and the stained glass window was on the right, not the center." The precision of the observation startled Elaine. These were details that would require architectural knowledge or recollection, and the boy possessed neither. The following weeks brought another breakthrough. During a quiet conversation before bedtime, Michael recounted a scene longer than any previous report. He described himself walking down a cold stone corridor, hearing footsteps echo, and holding an old wooden beaded rosary. He said that, shortly before dying, he believed he had received a kind of spiritual guidance, something he needed to pass on, but for which he ran out of time. He was visibly distressed as he recounted this. The mother gently asked if he knew what the message was. He only replied, "It was about mercy, but I can't remember the rest." For Stevenson, this type of emotional fragment, tied to the feeling of an unfinished task, was a recurrent element in well-documented cases. Therefore, he suggested the next step should be to investigate parish archives in Bavaria, especially in small communities affected during World War II, where many records were partially preserved. The search for the identity of Father Johann had just begun, but there were already enough clues to connect the American boy to a history buried by time and the destruction of the post-war period. The investigation gained new momentum when Stevenson, after carefully analyzing the material sent by the Turners, forwarded a list of potential regions in Bavaria that might fit Michael's account. Among the places mentioned were small parishes near Regensburg, Passau, and Rosenheim, areas where Baroque churches commonly featured St. Augustine's stained glass windows both before and after the war. The family then decided to collaborate with an independent researcher in the United States who had access to digitized German historical archives. Their goal was to map priests named Johann, who had been active between 1930 and 1945. Meanwhile, Michael's memories at home became more articulated. He seemed calm in the mornings, but at night, as he fell asleep, episodes of intense clarity occurred. On one such occasion, waking from a nightmare, he described a new scene to his parents. He said he was in a small sacristy, writing something hastily on a yellowed piece of paper. He noted that the walls were thick, there was a smell of smoke in the air, and a distant sound, similar to airplanes, could be heard in the background. The father noted everything and sent the report to Stevenson, who immediately recognized the possible connection to the time of Allied bombings over Germany during World War II. The American researcher assisting the family found, after weeks of searching, an entry that caught attention. A priest named Johann Meindl, born in 1898 and ordained in 1923, who had served in a small parish on the outskirts of Rosenheim. The entry indicated that the church had been partially destroyed in 1945 and rebuilt years later. Among the descriptions available was the information that a St. Augustine stained glass window was located on the right side of the altar, exactly as Michael had described. The information was sent to Stevenson, who assessed the match as strong but still insufficient. The discovery coincided with a new significant episode. One Saturday morning, while helping his mother in the kitchen, Michael suddenly stopped, clutching the dish towel tightly. He said in a low voice, "I died there. It was all very fast." The mother, unsure how to react, asked him to take a deep breath and only describe what he remembered. The boy explained seeing bright lights and feeling a violent impact, followed by darkness. There was no mention of pain, just the sense of sudden loss. Reading the report, Stevenson noted that this type of description appeared in cases where the death of the presumed former personality had been abrupt. Days later, a new detail surfaced. Flipping through a historical atlas of Europe, a common school textbook, Michael pointed his finger at an area near southern Bavaria and murmured, "The hill was behind the church. There were pine trees there." This comment seemed trivial, but by comparing it with old images of the Rosenheim region, the family found photos showing exactly that configuration: a Baroque church, rebuilt after the war, and a line of pine trees in the background. However, the element that most impressed Stevenson was different. In one of the audios recorded during sleep, Michael clearly said, "The message is in the box, inside the stone." For the researcher, this type of statement, which concerned a physical, specific, and verifiable location, was a key point in serious investigations. If an actual hiding place mentioned by the boy existed, it would be possible to confirm or rule out the correlation with the life of Johann Meindl. The case, which until then had been just a series of fascinating reports, was moving toward a crucial point: historical verification. The identity of the priest and the alleged message left behind began to emerge as central elements of the investigation. With the new elements in hand, Stevenson directed the family to deepen the investigation into Johann Meindl. Although he wasn't making long journeys himself during this period, he maintained contact with European researchers who could verify details in local archives. Thus, a more formal search was initiated in the diocese responsible for the parishes around Rosenheim. The goal was simple and strict: to confirm whether Meindl had truly existed, whether he had served in the church described by Michael, and, above all, whether there was any documentary clue consistent with the boy's memories. While this was happening in Germany, Michael in the United States was going through a period of increasing sensitivity. The parents noticed that certain images and sounds seemed to trigger involuntary memories. One afternoon, during a school rehearsal, the deep sound of an electronic organ caused the boy to interrupt the practice and, visibly distressed, walk out into the hallway. When the teacher found him, she heard a short, firm phrase from him: "I used to play before masses, but the last time, it didn't happen." He couldn't explain the reason. He only associated the memory with the day the church was destroyed. Just a few days later, an envelope from Germany brought the first historical confirmations. There was indeed a priest named Johann Meindl, who served in a small parish bombed in April 1945. The records contained a reference to the sudden deaths of parishioners during the attack, but there was no explicit confirmation regarding the priest's fate. Some documents suggested he might have died inside the church, but the information was inconclusive, as much of the archives from that period were lost. The most notable detail, however, appeared in a letter written decades earlier by a parishioner. It mentioned that Meindl had a habit of jotting down spiritual reflections on small slips of paper, which he kept in wooden boxes made by local artisans. The box described in the document was very similar to the one Michael had molded in clay weeks before. This point represented a convergence between spontaneous memory and historical record for Stevenson, a rare but not unheard of scenario in his research. When the mother discreetly showed the boy an old photo of the parish, now confirmed as the church where Meindl had served, Michael reacted reservedly but profoundly. He looked for a few seconds and said, "There. I went in through a side door." The stone was behind the altar, but low, close to the ground. The anxious family confirmed with the German researcher that the rebuilt church had maintained the original structure of the altar, including some remaining stones from the pre-war period. The researcher then reported an additional piece of information. During the 1950s renovation, masons mentioned finding a small recess behind one of the lower stones. There were no records of the contents. The reports were oral and vague, but the information, matching what Michael described, drew immense attention from Stevenson. From this point on, the case no longer seemed like just a series of coincidences. There were now a real priest named Johann Meindl, a church with a St. Augustine stained glass window on the right side, a dated bombing, a possible recess behind the altar, and an emotionally consistent description from Michael. Over the following weeks, the boy revealed another crucial fragment. Sitting in his room on a quiet night, he told his mother, "I wrote it because I was afraid I wouldn't be heard. It was about compassion, about forgiving before it was too late." The mother noted every word. Stevenson considered this account compatible with patterns observed in former personalities who, facing extreme crises, recorded spiritual messages or personal instructions. The investigation was ready for its conclusion, to finally verify what might have been inside that stone so many decades ago. The final phases of the investigation advanced with the collaboration of the German researcher connected to the Diocese of the Rosenheim region. After weeks of analyzing documents, archive photos, and reports from elderly residents, he sent the Turners a detailed report on the reconstruction of the church destroyed in 1945. Among the statements collected, one drew attention. A retired mason, over 80 years old at the time, remembered finding, during the altar renovation, a small, severely damaged wooden box almost reduced to splinters. He recounted that it contained nothing but fragments of darkened, illegible paper. The material, he said, was thrown away because it seemed unrecognizable. This recollection, though not confirming the contents, exactly matched Michael's descriptions. The news was received by the family in silence. Michael, now calmer, listened to his mother's explanation and only said, "Then the message never reached anyone's hands." Stevenson, informed of the report, replied that from a methodical standpoint, the findings strengthened the historical correlation but did not allow for conclusions about the message's content. Nevertheless, he acknowledged that the totality of the evidence made the case one of the most consistent involving spontaneous memories of past lives reported by children. The boy spoke less about the past in the following weeks. His behavior gradually returned to its previous routine, as if the cycle of memories were concluding. This change was consistent with what Stevenson had already observed in hundreds of cases. Intense memories tended to fade as the child grew older. For the parents, the relief was mixed with the responsibility of preserving everything that had been documented. Shortly before his 12th birthday, Michael shared a final fragment. He said he remembered writing the message on plain paper, folding it, and placing it in the box. He reiterated that, while doing so, he believed that piece of paper should be found by someone who would survive the war. When the mother cautiously asked if he remembered the words, the boy replied, "It was supposed to say that no one should hold hatred, even if the world is ending." He added nothing more after that. These statements were sent to Stevenson, who commented in writing that the episode exemplified a recurrent pattern in spontaneous memories, a strong emotional charge linked to the moment of death, often fragmented and symbolic. He emphasized that the reports, though not fully verifiable, were consistent with real elements from the biography of the priest Johann Meindl and the destruction of the German parish in 1945. He also noted that the case, without providing supernatural interpretations, clearly demonstrated the complexity of human memory and its possible relationship with events not experienced in the current life. In time, the family decided to keep the case private, sharing only the necessary records with researchers studying the topic. Michael continued his studies, retaining only a vague emotional memory of what he called the priest's life. He didn't speak again about the box, the stained glass window, or the stone behind the altar. His life unfolded like that of any American teenager, far from the memories that had so profoundly disturbed him. Nevertheless, the case remained significant for scholars. It offered a rare example where the spontaneous utterances of a child corresponded with the historical records of another life, within the time frame studied by Ian Stevenson. There was no dramatization, nor were there definitive conclusions. Only a coherent accumulation of facts, emotions, and recollections that, together, formed a fascinating and deeply human portrait of the persistence of memory. Thus ends the narrative, which preserves what could be reconstructed of the possible priest Johann Meindl and the American boy who, for a brief time, believed he carried a message left behind in the ruins of war.